Welcome back, guys. It's episode 3 of On The Dotcast, and we've dressed up for the occasion. We're looking a little different. I promise these are costumes. These are not our outfits of choice. Chris, talk us through why we're dressed up.
Yes, today we're partying like it's 2009. Got our skinny jeans on, got Two-Door Cinema Club on the iPod, and tickets to see The Hangover at the weekend.
Can't
But we're
wait.
all for a valid reason, all for a good, honest research purpose. Today we're talking about generations. And we want to compare generations, but do it in a different and maybe a bit more scientific way than you might be used to when you hear about these things.
Yeah, nice. So just to be clear, we're basically going to be comparing today's 16 to 27-year-olds to the 16 to 27-year-olds in 2009, right?
Yeah, 2009, 2010, yeah.
And just to be clear, that's not very easy to do, right? It's not a very common piece of research that you could do.
Yeah, exactly. It's so, in a nutshell, yeah, we want to compare Gen Zs as they are now, the last 2 years, with millennials when they were the equivalent age. So most of the time, if you hear stats about Gen Z or millennials, you'll probably hear this, 35% of Gen Z think, whatever, let's say they want to help the environment. And then you'll see, and then it's 32% of millennials, 29% of baby boomers. And of course, we sometimes use this to gauge generational insight. We occasionally do this ourselves. But then, of course, if you think, well, generations are meant to be defined by experiences when they grew up, how do you know what's the result of that versus just regular age differences, right? Because people do change as they get older. That's something that we all know about. So, yeah, what we're able to do with the research we have, the data we have, and the platform we have is to do more of a control for that time variable. Yeah. Been running surveys since 2009. And it means that we've now just been doing research for so long where we can say, okay, yeah, we've got these two distinct groups of people at these points in time, and we can make these comparisons thanks to a group of questions that we've been running ever since our first survey. And today we're going to dive into them. But I think before we do that, I think it's safe to ask you, Jenna, not to make this sound like a police interrogation, but other than wearing this, that maybe you could take us through, what were you doing in 2009?
Okay, so I was living large. I was just about to start my GCSEs. I was at school. Obviously, I'd come home. I'd play Club Penguin. Loved Club Penguin for about 3 hours. Was wearing a lot of eyeliner, which I've tried to replicate today. I'm method acting right now. I was also obsessed with Disney Channel. So I'd watch Disney Channel every evening, specifically Hannah Montana, Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, all the good stuff. To be honest, still am obsessed with those shows. I also had a Nokia phone, which I had like one song downloaded on, and I would play that out loud, like on speaker. And that was just
yourself,
my favorite thing. Yeah, just to myself, just, to my ear in the back of the bus. Didn't invest in a pair of headphones just yet. So what about you? Can you help me through your 2009?
Yeah, I'm slightly older than you. And of course, years are like decades when you're that age, right? So I'd been getting ready to do my A-levels.
Okay.
Having every waking thought taken up by UCAS, an organization I now realize I haven't thought of in about 10, 15 years. But yeah, I'm sort of dressed in the classic landfill indie look, but I consider myself a bit of a hipster at the time. So listening to a lot of Animal Collective, National, Beach House, those kinds of bands. But the device point you make is quite interesting. And I think often when you ask people this question, that's one of the things they consider because it is one of these biggest points of difference. It's something we're going to go into. So I got my first phone of any kind in 2009. I was a bit of an exception because I got a Sony Ericsson Cybershot type thing, which I think is quite similar.
Was that a flip? No, I'm thinking of the Motorola's. Do you remember Motorola's?
Yeah. But I think functionality-wise, it would have been quite similar to the one you had. So it sort of has the internet, but sort of not. I was a bit of an exception because I think most of my friends were getting proper smartphones at that time. I remember, when you're at school, like your friends get like new stuff in the summer, and when you come back, things are quite different.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, he'd done well in his GCSEs, so his parents had given him this new iPhone. I remember him showing it to me in this game called Doodle Jump, and I remember thinking like this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Like the phone's so sleek, like the game looks so cool. I feel like I'm looking at the future compared to what I have myself.
I had I don't think I could access the internet on my Nokia phone, but it did have this little World Wide Web logo in the bottom, and I would sometimes try and click on it, and it would just be like a blank page. And I do remember thinking like, God, how cool would it be if I could actually access the internet via my phone, which now is such a like strange concept to even like wish for because it's just a given, right? You would never really buy a phone now if you couldn't access internet on it.
Yeah. So I think that's a useful point for us to, start exploring the data and teasing out some of these differences of what they might mean. I think device is the main place to start. So, just to mention that for what we talk about today, we're going to focus mostly on UK, US markets just because they're the ones we know better, shared language, all that kind of thing. But if you did want to replicate the kind of work we're doing, you can obviously go and do that on our platform. So, yeah, you mentioned a Nokia.
Yeah.
And 2009, 2010, there were a quarter of millennials that owned one. So they were still one of the biggest phone brands. You were in quite good company. And they, along with Samsung and Sony, who of course made mine, were the biggest players in the market. And only 1 in 10 millennials actually had an iPhone at that stage. So still, I don't know about minority, but they weren't quite the big thing that they were yet.
Yeah, still quite niche.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you fast forward today, and over 2/3 of Gen Zers have an iPhone.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, much more established now. And what percentage do you think of Gen Zers do you think have a Nokia these days?
Okay. Process of deduction. So there's like 33% left to play with. I'd say maybe 10%.
It's 2%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they are still making phones, but yeah, clearly they're not one of the main players in the
Dominating
market
the space,
anymore.
yeah.
And so this is the thing, obviously this data is quite interesting to see these changes, but like it's easy to think, well, yeah, so what, mate? Like everyone knows that people have smartphones now, people have got iPhones. But it's the implications of this that's so interesting, because I think most people would say, who talk about research these things would say this is the big difference between millennials and Gen Z, or Gen Z and other generations, is that they've grown up with smartphones being a kind of established device. They probably grew up having one in their teenage years. And because of that, they sort of have internet access, social media is kind of just around them at all times. Whereas, I don't know about you, but I feel when I was this age, like internet's still kind of something I can access through a computer, and that computer would be turned off. I would go online and then go offline.
Yeah.
But it was limited to a particular device. It wasn't with me at all times.
100%. I'm pretty sure in 2009, I could be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure we still had dial-up internet. So if someone called through on the landline, like it would make the to actually get onto the internet. And then if someone called the house phone, it would disconnect.
Yeah.
And it's really funny because like now, like my phone's in my pocket all the time and I'm always contactable. But back then when I would be signing off on MSN with my friends, I'd be like, GTG, like I've got to go because I'm turning the computer off and you will not be able to contact me until I'm at school tomorrow.
I'm having dinner now. Like,
exactly.
I can't be reached.
Exactly. Or even like just the concept of like BRB. Like now you would never interrupt a chat to be like, be right back. I'm just going to you just stop replying, and then 2 seconds later you can pick your phone back up and get back into the conversation. So yeah, it's a completely different like relationship with the internet. There's no off button.
Yeah, and you mentioned dial-up, and it's quite funny because I think we sometimes forget in some parts of the world that did stick around till quite late. I mean, you mentioned this to me earlier. I was inspired to look. I think by 2015, I think even in Poland, a quarter of people still got online via dial-up. Wow. So some parts of the world, that transition of what you're describing to the sort of smartphone first world is like it happened even quicker and even more rapidly. And you'd think made generational differences even more pronounced much more quickly. But yeah, so there's some additional stats I wanted to share from some of our early research, just to ground us in this time machine that we're occupying. Yeah. Like the worlds that we knew as millennials and what it was actually like, especially in terms of going online. Yeah. So 2009, 2010, less than half of us browse the internet on our phone. Yeah. I think it's like you were saying, it was just fundamentally quite difficult to do. Of course, you're using a keypad, right?
Yeah. Totally different.
To use it. Like that's not easy. I think, data was a lot more expensive, mobile data. I might do it every once in a while to check the football scores. And I think, I don't know how far I want to push it.
And you'd be quite scared about that, right? Like the idea, like I've heard horror stories of like, I was accidentally on roaming when I was on holiday, and the bill would be like multiple thousands of pounds or whatever. And it was just such a scare. Like using up data was so scary. And like topping up on credit. And, I've sent too many texts today. I need to top my phone up. Like it's a completely different landscape.
So some other stats I found quite interesting. So at this time, only a quarter of us, I think we can use us, installed an app in a given month. The app.
Oh, wow.
So the App Store only started in 2008. Like it's more recent, I think a lot of people would realize. I think only 13% of us were paying for something with our phone. So, you've probably seen, it's a trend that comes around every so often. I've seen on TikTok recently the idea that millennials will go to like the big device to pay for things. I don't know how sort of true that is now, but you could see how there's a grain of truth in that. That all these things you mentioned, like laptops are more secure, websites built for this.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's talk about other differences between Gen Z and millennials. Like, what do all these stats mean? Like, what can we infer from all this data?
Yeah, so I mean, that's why I want to start with it, because it's a useful thing to have in the back of mind and think, okay, how much of this is because of the phones? You know, how much might this be other differences? So there's one that I find quite interesting, that compared to millennials at the same age, this 16 to 27 age grouping, Gen Z are more likely to be single, but also more likely to be married. Which, yeah, I can't explain this. The main reason is because, of course, there's that third category of in a relationship.
Okay.
That's gone down quite a bit. Some of it has gone into marriage. Some of it has gone into, okay, now more people say they're single, identify as being single, however you want to describe it.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. I sort of have a rough theory. I've not thought through much, but maybe something around online dating and dating, getting partners obviously changed a lot.
Yeah.
Does that contribute in the sense of like it changes how you perceive as when you're in a relationship versus not?
I guess. So essentially what we're saying is that we're seeing more Gen Zs in either extreme camp, right? They're either married or they're fully single, right? That's what we're seeing. I guess one of the things that I find quite funny is, and it's like a running joke, like when you try and explain like a parent, like, you know, what your relationship status is, there's so many different stages that now exist that probably didn't before. So now you start off in the talking stage, and then you go into being exclusive, which is different to being boyfriend and girlfriend. That's another step that comes afterwards. So there's all these different stages. And so I guess the lines are probably a little bit more blurred between being single and actually being in a relationship. Like there's a lot of hurdles.
Yeah.
A lot of labels to get there first.
Yeah. Soft launch, hard launch.
Exactly.
Yeah. All these things come with it. Yeah, that's interesting. And another area that I think that, you know, maybe contributing to it. Well, actually, let me put that on ice for a moment, because there's other differences in the world of work. And I think this is a useful juncture for us to give a bit of a sort of, if you like, theoretical background to generations, because I find this useful for myself. I mean, I remember starting market research in 2017, of course, and people would be like, or my manager at the time would be like, yeah, you're doing a blog on Gen Z. I'd be like, what's Gen Z? Like, what's a generation? Like, these are things we talk about a lot within ourselves, but it's like, where does this stuff come from?
Yeah.
Like, you know, someone has to have created this idea, right?
Yeah.
So as well as technology, smartphones thing, one potential difference I think is mentioned is the impact of 2008 financial crisis. I think you were talking today about recession pop, right? That's a very sort of millennial coded genre.
Yeah. Recession pop is very much about like, you know, we can't afford to pay our rent, so we'll go to the club and get really drunk. Like that was the priority.
Yeah. I mean, it's all coming back to us now, I'm sure. But I'd say there's sort of two broad theories, camps about where generations come from at the moment. So ones we talked about so far, mostly this idea that technology, smartphones, a driver, that's associated largely with an academic called Jean Twenge, who published a book on generations relatively recently, I think last year maybe.
So really recent.
Yeah. She's been doing research on it for a while. I think she'd written specifically about Gen Z, or iGen, which I think was her original name for them before Gen Z kind of cottoned on. But then there's the sort of older view of generations that people might be more familiar with, this idea of big event happens when you're young, you're exposed to it in some way, because your brain is developing, you're developing in the world,
right? That
has a lasting impact on you.
Yeah. So defined by moments in history. So World War II, Great Depression, Civil Rights Movement. These are all formative years, basically, and generations are defined almost as those events bookend the different generations, right?
Exactly, and 2008 being a classic example. Yeah. So it's interesting because in our data, it doesn't actually appear in the sort of time capsule that we're sat in 2009, 2010. The sort of high youth unemployment, like it was highest since records began in the UK. Youth unemployment was in 2011. So that's when it starts to be like people are graduating, there's no jobs, and that's probably where the sort of you know, recession pop sentiment people think of. That's when it starts to come in. But if you were going to do that kind of analysis of events, you'd say, okay, for millennials it's 2008, and I imagine for Gen Z it's going to be COVID.
Yeah, 100%.
Because that is the biggest thing.
100%.
And there are suggestions we see of it in our data that maybe millennials are more cautious around their finances. And there's been other research that's done, effect of Great Depression, I think, on people, that perhaps it made them more financially thrifty. But of course, these events that are mentioned in that respect, they're often quite American. And that's sometimes cited as a bit of a limitation with that approach, is like, well, how much is this true just in one particular country? Yeah. But there's another interesting difference I want to identify that gets a bit back to the technology point, I think. So Gen Z are more likely, at that same point in age to be working in a self-employed capacity or as freelancers. And I do think there might be a bit of a role from smartphones here as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I feel like we had a stat on this a while ago. So we obviously publish a Gen Z report every year. And the one we did earlier, there was a stat that really stood out to me. Basically, I've got it here. Basically, more Gen Z say they work as an content creator or an influencer than those that say they work as a nurse or healthcare worker.
Yeah.
So more identify as an influencer than anyone working in a medical field, basically, which is fascinating. Like the opportunities are at their fingertips to pursue those types of careers, right?
Yeah. And just for context, we have a question survey. We ask people, what jobs do you do? And I think there's around 140 listed jobs. Right. And for Gen Z, influencer content creator is one of the biggest jobs. And it's funny, we see that in our data, like some of the big research projects, censuses, like not all of them are fully adapted to the influencer creator economy. Like everyone knows it's big, like we all sort of recognize that, but it's actually quite hard to find measurement on it. But certainly what we see is like, there's a lot of people working in this capacity. And what we see on our estimates is bigger than I think a lot of people suppose. And in relation to Gen Z context, like there's an example of this I find quite interesting with the hardest geezer. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I haven't heard of him until today. So talk me through.
So he was the man who became the first person to run the entire length of Africa. He did this last year, and he became well known because he did a lot of content on social media. So he did short videos himself when he was running, and then a YouTube series that I think upload episodes of twice a week. And I think he would be considered a cusper. He's quite an old Gen Zer, but in the videos he talks a lot about how he felt social media gives people like him, he's from a working class background in Worthing, which is like a seaside town down south in England, social mobility. So it enabled him to reach out to people and say, I'm doing this thing. Can you give me finance? Can you give me sponsorship? Of course, YouTube gives him the platform, creates a program, allows him to raise more money through doing that. And if you watch the videos, when he's not running, like he's always on his phone because, of course, he's running a business at the same time, keeping in touch with these people. And it goes back to what we were saying about devices. Like, I don't think I saw a touch computer once. Yeah. And as part of me, it's very millennial coded, thinks the idea that you could do all that on a phone is just like...
too much.
Yeah, it's almost impossible. Like, how do you do it all that on a device so small? Yeah. The computer is serious business. I just think how he talks about it and what it represents shows that in terms of professional capacity, like how you can work, where you can work has changed quite a lot for young people. Totally.
I mean, I feel like I've grown up with a cohort of YouTubers who just started messing around on YouTube and making silly videos. Emma Chamberlain comes to mind. I know outside of this time capsule, she came on YouTube a little bit later than 2009, but she started documenting her life on YouTube and making these really funny videos, super relatable, was so successful that she dropped out of school, and she's now, runs her own business and is really successful on social media, has fantastic brand deals, and there's like a running joke now and the same applies for TikTok, like a running joke, like if only I was brave enough to be weird on YouTube or like put my personality on the internet like 15 years ago, I'd be set for life basically. And I mean, I guess it's never too late to start. There's a ton of like baby boomers taking to TikTok now and showing off their life, so it's still the opportunity's still there. I think it's just quite easy to look back and be like, oh, if I had started 10, 15 years ago, then...
I think one of my favorite genres of online video is kids who are clearly messing around on the summer holidays. Like, they've just got a lot of spare time and they're filming themselves. And of course, I mean, I did that with my friends, but we were just putting it on, Facebook, Bebo, the early social platforms, just entertain ourselves. Like, there was no way that they'd get a large audience. Yeah. And they probably wouldn't now anyway because they weren't very good. But for the people that are... especially through TikTok, algorithmic feeds, there's a natural way to get onto more people and you can become noticed.
Exactly.
Fair amount of comedians and performers now, that's a good route for them. So again, all speaks to what we're seeing from the data around work.
Exactly.
Now, I want to go, so there's one other question that we've been running from our survey since the first wave, all the way back in 2009, 2010. I want to save this one for last because I think this is in many ways the most revealing. Okay. And this is around what topics people talk about online. Because I think if you look at this as like a ranked list, it's like a great insight into what's more culturally relevant. Yeah. Again, for Gen Z compared to Millennials. So we're going to go through a few of them now. And I'll be interested again to see what perspective you have on these. Based on the one we just spoke about, freelancing gig economy, it doesn't feel too surprising that business is one of the things that's climbed up most.
Interesting.
So Gen Z much more likely, or it's more culturally relevant to them to be talking about online than it was to millennials.
Yeah. We covered that as well in the Gen Z report, and they're actually quite business savvy as a generation. I think they get a lot of stick for being like lazy and, you know, don't want to work a 9 to 5, but actually they're quite entrepreneurial. I've got a stat here. We've seen a 17% rise in the number of Gen Zs who've invested in stocks and shares since the end of 2022, an 11% rise in those interested in business, as you pointed out. So yeah, I think, the other thing as well is LinkedIn's their fastest growing social media platform. So I think that speaks to two things. One, the fact that they're growing up and they're moving into the workplace or have already moved into the workplace and are, you know, just broadening their network. But it does also speak to that business savvy trait.
Yeah. And I think, if you took that view of events are a source of difference, again, millennials because of 2008, like Gen Z don't have those sorts of reservations. Like they're more willing to be entrepreneurial, to take that risk because, I don't know about you, but I mean, anecdote is obviously never as good as data, but I've never had a credit card. Like the word credit sort of fills me with a kind of fear.
Really?
It's just,
That's really interesting.
Yeah. You know, probably because there's some subconscious association with it. But
So
to go back to topics, another one is sport, which has climbed quite a lot. It's gone from 14th most talked about to 4th most talked about.
Wow.
And again, my sort of rough theory is maybe because this sort of ubiquitous internet access we talked about, easiest comment on things in real time, right? Because you're sort of always plugged in. Sport is, of course, something you engage with in real time. And another big climb, I think, that makes a similar logic at work or influence social media, which is food/restaurants. It's gone from 16th to 6th most talked about.
Wow.
And I always find it's quite interesting because I think people forget that in this sort of era, the time capsule we're in, like, you didn't take photos of food at restaurants. Like, it wasn't really a thing.
Yeah.
Whereas clearly now,
as soon as it's on the table, it's snap.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. The cooking shows, I think YouTube maybe played a role in that and the rise of like watching cooking and that sort of thing. But also we've seen that, you know, younger generations don't necessarily go to search engines to find recommendations for restaurants and stuff. They actually turn to Instagram and TikTok. So I think that is definitely feeding into that. The other thing as well that I'd say on sports, and we covered this last year in Connecting the Dots, but highlight reels of sports make sports so much more accessible to a much broader audience that don't necessarily subscribe to a specific sports channel or, you know, have a subscription to sports viewing. And we actually saw that very much was driving the rise in popularity of combat sports in the US last year. So yeah, I mean, short form video, highlight reels, even things like actual athletes, you know, having presence on social media and you know, attracting that fan base does so much for the kind of sports vertical as a whole. So, you know, it makes so much sense. But again, it all does come back to social media and how prevalent it is to just, you know, follow anything that you're interested in, right?
Yeah, and you just wonder as well, has it helped unlock new audiences? I mean, the F1 girlie is the sort of archetype now, right?
Yeah.
Someone who might not have been involved with the sport before, but social media's given a slightly different pathway, maybe more led by the personalities to get into the sport. Now, move on to other topics that have climbed quite a lot and perhaps more relevant for Gen Z. This one's a bit of a twofer. So it's politics and environmental issues that have both climbed up the list quite a lot.
That's interesting. The politics thing, I was going to say, like, that's because it feels like so much political stuff has happened in the past 10 years. You know, Brexit, there's the shifting of governments, there's so much that's gone on. But actually, when you zoom out, there's always so much going on with politics. Like, the past 10 years haven't been like unprecedented in the political landscape as, say, you know, the past 30, 40 years. It's probably all relative, right? But I would say that maybe, I don't know, I've seen a lot of like political podcasts come up and, you know, that then translates into shorts on reels and TikToks and stuff. So I again, it's about how social media just makes all these topics more easily accessible. What was the other one that you said?
Environmental issues, yeah.
So this is really interesting. When I was doing some research into kind of like university courses that have become more prevalent, and the hunch for this is the fact that I've got a younger cousin who decided to study sustainability at uni, which is something that I, to be honest, hand on heart, never even would have considered to study. It wasn't necessarily a topic in my head that I would pursue a career in, that would have job prospects or anything like that. Now, probably because the climate crisis is so much more critical than it was 10 years ago, it's a slightly different landscape. But I feel like Gen Z adopt more of an activist mentality. And so the kind of gravitating to environmental issues, maybe they feel like they can, I don't know, exert some change on that.
Yeah, no, I think what you mentioned about politics is very fair. I mean, you have to remember this data is about things that people talk about online.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's quite a specific place, and we are using that as a proxy for other things. But yeah, I think this is something Jean Twenge mentioned in her book, is that maybe, let's say in the 1990s, political engagement will be writing a letter to your MP or your local senator, whereas now, of course, you can just put it into the void, and that is a level of political engagement.
Yeah.
Another theory I've heard mentioned is that maybe if more people are going to university, that makes them more politically minded as well. The last thing, or the thing that's had the biggest cultural change, if you use this measure, to Millennials and Gen Z, is something that's gone down, and gone down quite a lot. And this is alcoholic drinks. So change here is quite staggering. Yeah. So for Millennials, alcoholic drinks were the third most talked about topic online. For Gen Z, it's down in 20th place.
Wow, from 3rd to 20?
Yes, yeah.
That's crazy.
And I should say for context that we do know from long-running, government academic studies that, alcohol consumption for young people is down considerably. Yeah. So that makes sense that it would go down, but it seems like the culture around alcohol has perhaps dipped off as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, this is a callback to us joking about recession pop, right? So back in our day, in this time capsule that we're in, recession pop was so much about, okay, we can't afford to pay our bills, let's go out and get drunk, go to the club, we only have tonight. Like, there's a running joke that every 2009 song had the word tonight in it repeatedly, and everything was about tonight. So there was that kind of short-term mentality of let's just have fun tonight, and very little regard for tomorrow's hangover. But I do think culturally it's become less of a pastime. Like the millennial drinking culture is so much about parties and clubs and all of that. And maybe that's half based on the shows that we grew up watching, like Jersey Shore and stuff like that. Like anything on MTV, there was so much alcohol fueled for that. Whereas now, I don't know, it's a slightly different media landscape that we're consuming, and maybe it doesn't focus as much on alcohol. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they just looked at us and thought, no, I don't want any of that. Cancel. I'm going to back out of that. So yeah, I think before we move on from this, I think there's always a question looking at the background behind talking about generations. And we should address it
because so I've seen a lot of rhetoric online about how generational marketing is lazy. And if you only segment by generation, you're not actually looking at demographics and psychographics and all the other things that truly matter and shape your audience. And to an extent, I do agree with that. But I think they can be a useful starting point. Yeah. Like, I relate to millennial memes so much. That's because it's my language, right? Yeah. Like, I don't think a Gen Z would find cat videos as funny as I find cat videos.
No, I agree completely. I think, the word I sometimes think of as shorthand or top level overview. It's like I don't use that as the basis for everything that I do. But it's, I also think that generations is something it's sort of collectively all of us in, research academia. I think it's something that we're actively exploring. I don't think it's necessarily a settled debate, but based on the things that we talked about today and other research has been published recently, I think there are plausible reasons to find differences. Yeah. So again, to go back to Jean Twenge, at the start of her book, she says, if you imagine one of the civilizations, how they're quite uncontacted, like North Sentinel Island or something, it's like it would be crazy to assume there's any generational differences there. So there must be a sort of driver reason behind that. And that's why she has the technology thesis. Yeah. And I think you alluded to it before, but I think there's an old way of thinking about generations. Sometimes I see this in a workplace context. It's like, managers, get ready for Gen Z or Gen Alpha.
Exactly.
They're going to be the most lazy work-shy generation. I don't think any generation is like a rewriting of human nature. Yeah. I think if you look in history, people have always said that about the next generation. Yeah. It probably says more about the observer than the actual young people. It just sort of says that you're getting older, you've forgotten what it's like to be that age. Yeah. And I do find the technology argument quite persuasive. Yeah, totally. Based on those differences, because I think you look at most technologies that come in, especially 20th century, they've been quite powerful and led to substantial changes, more so than that old school influence of events thesis, that you do see some hints of that maybe around financial crisis like COVID. I think we kind of need more time, more evidence to see any potential influence. And the other thing as well, I mean, I've got a sort of few personal hunches with this. I think there's something about with social media, it gives us, because you were touching on this, like, why do we feel so connected to this stuff?
Yeah.
Like, it does get a reaction out of people. It's like being online gives you a bigger network of people your age, rather than necessarily like you're kind of determined by who's next to you. So this idea of like, I almost think sometimes like, okay, maybe generations didn't exist in the first place and we kind of invented them by mistake, but now that they're here, they do kind of have a material reality behind them.
They fit. Exactly. Yeah. So I guess, would you, in a pithy answer, would you summarize them as arbitrary or necessary?
Well, I think they're sort of, now they're verging on a fact of life, really. I think and I think as well, there's some critiques about, well, are these definitions quite arbitrary? I think you can say that about lots of other things, like what's a high earner? Like what's an adult? You know, these things have always been quite arbitrarily defined at the boundaries if you really put them up close. But yeah, I think they're plausible reasons to suggest differences, which means the differences do matter. But again, they're more of a sort of to get a top level understanding. And of course, if you're doing sort of particular targeting, you'd want more depth and more detail.
Yeah,
but
of course.
Useful starting point.
Yeah, 100%. A springboard. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next topic, astrology.
Yes.
So this is our data versus discourse discussion. So I basically wanted to see what the data says about this, because to me personally, it feels like everyone in my life and online seems to be blaming anything that's happening to them on the stars. So any ex that comes back into your life, any issue that goes wrong at work, it's because Mercury's in retrograde. And this is like a running joke, like, oh my God, everything gone wrong today, is Mercury in retrograde. So there's that element of it. There's also this really interesting, so I'm prime Saturn's return age. Do you know what Saturn's return is?
You'll have to explain it to me.
Okay, so Saturn's return, I'm going to try and do this justice. Basically, apparently, Saturn takes around 27 to 30 years to come back to the exact place it was when you were born.
Okay.
So what it brings with it is a huge shift in your life. And usually that emulates a kind of quarter life crisis. So everyone will joke about, oh, this massive crazy crisis that happened when I was 28, 29 or 30, right? This is what happens. And so it's an astrological event. It puts you through turmoil, but then you come out the other side as a restored human, rebirthed, all sorts of wonderful things. And Ariana Grande actually has a dedicated track about Saturn's return on one of her most recent albums. So it's very much reference in pop culture, you know, but it all ties into this topic of astrology. And I just wanted to know, like, are we seeing anything in our data? Because it feels like this is on the climb. Are we seeing anything in our data that suggests that interest in astrology is up? And who's interested in it? Because my cohort, as we spoke about last episode, it's women my age. So what does our data say? Yeah,
so there are interesting things about it. I can also mention, like, with it ties back to generations, there are some theories that maybe younger people have, they sort of assign agency to like things outside of them, which might explain why this is happening. But
like an external locus of control.
Exactly. But as far as you mentioned, interest in astrology is up, and we have a data point about this in GDY USA. So this is focusing on more on the American context. So interest is up, I think, 18% since 2020. And I think for me, what validates that as a trend is we also see increases for things like alternative medicine, meditation, spirituality, that feel like they're part of the same bracket.
Interesting, yeah.
You know, holistic practices, spiritual wellness, whatever you'd want to call it. But what's interesting is that if you look at the people most likely to be into it, they're what I'd almost consider quite old school astrology audiences.
Oh, interesting.
So in the main, these are readers of women's magazines, and they're a bit older.
Yeah.
So, you know, I am sort of imagine like, God, if I was waiting for my mum at the hairdresser, and you see people like flicking to the horoscopes, that kind of behavior. I think that's actually where it's more established. And in fact, interesting astrology is young people's gone down.
Oh.
So the main increases have come from, I think the main age group is 45 to 54s.
Women.
45 to 54s overall.
Okay.
I'm not sure about the gender front, but it's more of an older audience than you think.
That is surprising. I really thought it would be younger.
But I think it's sort of, because we mentioned this sort of data discourse, you know, like, fact checking the discourse, whatever. Yeah. But I think it touches on an interesting part of that is that sort of online commentary, memes, like they often sort of tip you off about something, but it's when you sort of refer back to population level data, you of course understand like, well, that's a kind of narrow section of people who are
Yeah, it's a
active
bubble.
online, posting online.
Yeah.
And it can normally give you a sense of like something that's going on, but of course you realize how much bigger the world is
Yeah.
and where behaviors come from. But there was one thing, really interesting thing I found looking into this data. So as well as readers of women's mags, there was an audience that's very, very likely to be in astrology, like much more than the average person, which I just found quite funny. So we have this question in our survey about life events you expect to happen in the next 6 months.
Yeah.
So this is things like get a new job, quit your job, maybe have a child. One of those options is to get engaged.
Right.
And these people who expect to get engaged are much more likely to be into astrology. And
Wow.
there's part of me that wonders if that's some kind of manifesting. It's
Yeah.
like, well, I expect to be get engaged. Maybe I'm not the one doing the proposing. So, you know.
So I need to know when in the stars it's
Exactly,
going to happen.
exactly,
That's hilarious. Speaking of manifestation, when I was looking, because I agree, I do think it kind of ties into the whole, like the astrology subject ties into, you know, a lot of the spiritual wellness stuff that we talked about. And I was just interesting to see the Google trends of the word manifest and to what extent it climbed. And around 2019, it was pretty steady. And around 2019, it had a big spike. And then late 2021, massive spike. And so I definitely think in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen, or as far as I can understand it, that the idea of manifesting has become so much more prominent, right? It's something, I think it's very much tied to, I might be wrong here, but like The Secret, that book, The Secret, which is all about like the law of attraction and manifesting good things and thinking positive thoughts.
Yeah.
It's quite an old book, but I think it's been brought into popular culture via Hollywood, and it's been really pushed as a kind of like a spiritual awakening. And I think it's been very like Hollywoodized.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because when I think about it, I think, like the word manifesting, I know it now, it seems quite common, but I don't think I'd heard it in that way until a few years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So are there any other interesting audiences?
Yeah, one of the audience where interest in astrology has grown the most, and it's grown by 154%, was one I found absolutely fascinating. So there's people who own a Tesla.
Oh.
Yeah. So I don't know about you.
158% increase.
154% since 2020.
Increase in astrology.
Interest, yeah.
That's so funny.
People own a Tesla. And, I'm not exactly sure why that might be, but I don't know about you, when I think of Tesla, I think, probably interested in Elon Musk or the companies, your science tech interested people, like sort of quite rational, quite scientific. Wouldn't expect them to be that much more interested in astrology. So
that's really
maybe the next Tesla model will have some sort of
horoscope daily horoscope integration. Genius. Okay, let's move on to the local lowdown. So just to remind our viewers, local lowdown is basically when we dive into a specific country or market that is displaying certain interesting trends, and displaying certain behavior that groups it's by the population. So where are we zooming into today?
This week we're going to Denmark. So last time we looked at Poland, example of a place with low consumer trust. It's got interesting knock-on effects around bottled water sales. Basically, the idea being don't trust the government, probably don't trust tap water, you buy more bottled water. So to change things up, we're going to look at the opposite. We're going to look at a place with very, very high levels of government trust, social trust, a place where studies have shown that people are more trusting of strangers than anywyer else. Just to give you an idea of the strength of the social fabric.
Yeah, very much the opposite.
Social cohesion.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. And so did a bit of follow-up research to this by talking to a colleague of ours who's from Denmark and doing a bit of reading. So I think it's generally accepted this because Denmark has a very strong welfare system, very generous one, you could say, where I think the logic is, well, if you see your tax money being spent well and public services are running efficiently, you trust the government, you sort of trust the kind of system that you operate in. But what we see in our data as potential knock-on effects in that are really, really interesting. So Danes are the most likely to say that contributing to their community is not important to them.
Oh.
That's not a value that they find important.
It's quite an individualistic culture.
So our colleague who's from Denmark, she gave me a really funny anecdote about this, which I think does summarize it quite well in the way that anecdotes can. She mentioned that she was with her mother once, and I think she happened to be, supporting a GoFundMe page and looking at it. And her mother's response was, well, can't the government just come and help them? Which is sort of an idea of like, well, the system will take care of you. Like, so that means that perhaps sort of individual contributions or contributions to the community, seeking support from the community maybe aren't as important.
Yeah.
And there's a second knock-on effect, a data point where Danes lead all other countries in our research that I think seems very connected to all this. So they're the most likely to say connecting to their culture is not a reason why they listen to music. So that's not as important to them. And again, I think it speaks to maybe more listening for more individualistic reasons.
Yeah.
If you have this system where social fabric is quite strong, you don't necessarily need these markers to create a sense of identity in a way that other countries where that sort of system isn't as strong, they become much more important as a thing for people to rally around.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Very much less about community and more about just kind of hands up, government can take care of everything. And, I can just look after my own stuff. Everyone else should be taken care of on their own. Yeah. So I suppose if you're wondering why do they listen to music? The most distinctive reason in Denmark is to escape from reality. Oh. So maybe that's individualistic behaviors. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe Copenhagen's like that in winter. I don't know. Have you been? I have. Okay. I have a couple of times. Yeah. Lovely people, lovely country. Did they help you out? Well, that should be the experience. Go to the main square and just, I don't know, pretend you're hurt or something. Pretend you need help. That's great. That's all we've got time for today. If you liked what you saw, you can obviously subscribe and click the bell to get notified for any new episodes. We do a newsletter every Wednesday where we cover topics just like these. All you have to do is give us your email address and you'll get trends delivered straight to your inbox. Thanks. Bye.